Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for spending some time with us tonight. Buenas noches a todos. Bienvenidos. Gracias por tomar de su tiempo para estar aquí con nosotros esta tarde. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join, as we can see participants joining the webinar. Vamos a darles unos minutos para que puedan unirse al webinar. Vemos que algunas personas se están uniendo. While folks are coming in, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a globe icon. This will allow you to access interpretation. We will be offering simultaneous Spanish interpretation tonight. Al pie de su página puede ver un globo. Allí podrá escoger su idioma. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea al español esta noche.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Dorland, and I'm going to serve as your facilitator for this evening. I also serve as the Deputy Superintendent for the school district. I'm going to wait about 30 more seconds to allow everyone who wants to participate to join our webinar this evening. So just please sit tight and we'll begin here in just a few minutes. As we're waiting, Betsy, it sounds like we want you to kind of stop sharing for a second, refresh, and then get back on just so we can make sure all of the adjustments we've made are good and that this is the most recent best presentation for this evening. Thanks, Betsy. It looks like we have a couple of participants who just joined. We're moving up to 103 participants and it's sort of settling down. So we'll begin here in just a second as soon as Betsy begins to reshare the slides. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone, to our Onward Community Town Hall. We are very excited to talk with you this evening. Welcome also to anyone who is watching on our 5-star YouTube channel. We look forward to the conversation this evening. Our first order of business here is to go through kind of our outcomes for the time together tonight. We really this evening, again, before I begin, for those of you who might have joined a little late, my name is Tracy Dorland. I'm the Deputy Superintendent for the school district, and I'll be your facilitator for this evening. In just a second here, I'll also introduce others who are part of our team tonight. But before we begin, let's just talk about what we're going to hopefully accomplish this evening. First, we want to build understanding around the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment quarantine guidelines and how those quarantine guidelines made our operations in our schools very challenging first semester, and how revisions to those guidelines will hopefully help it support in-person school operations in next semester. We also want to gather feedback from you all about the upcoming semester and the proposed plan that you received yesterday. And we want to hear what you have to say about that so that our superintendent, Chris Godowski, can represent your feedback at the board meeting during his discussion with the board tomorrow night. So that's our purpose. Before we move to the next slide, I want you all to know that when we planned this session initially, we did as a district staff have interest in more of a dialogue-based session where we could have more of a conversation with our community. And once we announced these sessions, we were flooded with interest. And many more people wanted to talk about this than what we anticipated. And so we did have to shift a little bit. And when you err on the side of more participation, you sometimes give up really meaningful interaction. And so we are hoping that the process tonight allows you to express your feedback about the plan and also provides an opportunity for you to understand some of the district's challenges. And we do apologize that it's not more of a conversation, but we're hopeful as we move into next semester that we can continue to do outreach to our community and provide for more conversation moving forward. So thank you for your patience with that. And we are happy that we're able to open up these sessions to more people, given the change in how we formatted it. In addition, one last thing, I just want to begin by validating the challenge that this year has been. We know that our students and our families have struggled with the back and forth between remote and in person. We know that remote learning is not going well for everyone, staff, students, families. And we know that you as parents are very concerned about your students. Some of you are very concerned about the pandemic. Many of you are concerned about learning loss that your students might be experiencing. And we want you to know that we share all of those concerns. And part of our interest tonight is to begin a conversation where we can talk as a community and come together to share our concerns and be solution oriented around how best to support our children and our students. And so I just want to validate that. It's been a very difficult year for everyone. And we're hoping that this is the start of a conversation that goes into next semester where we can really have honest and open dialogue about what people are struggling with, what students are struggling with, and how we can be as responsive as possible in the environment that we're all experiencing. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about our agenda. We're going to do some welcome and introductions. Then we're going to have a presentation, and I will let you know that the presentation is a little bit technical in nature. We have been collaborating with some parents on the content for this presentation, and they have asked for some deeper understanding about how to understand why our operations were so difficult with the quarantine guidelines. And so that can be pretty technical, and our Chief Operating Officer, Pat Hamilton, is going to walk you through that. We have made some adjustments since last night to make it a little less technical for you this evening, given some feedback from participants yesterday. But I do want you to know it's technical, and that's based on some requests that we've had from some family members. We will move into a panel discussion with some staff members who are experts around what's been going on in the district and how it's been working. And then we will do a poll, which will be a live survey for you to give us some feedback about the proposed plan that we communicated on Monday. Finally, we'll end with some next steps. So let's get into some introductions, and let me let you know who's here tonight with us. So Kathy Plomer is our board president. She will be here to welcome you this evening and listen to the conversation as she prepares for her role tomorrow night in our board meeting. Jamie Lockley is a board member as well, and she'll also be here to welcome you and listen in as she prepares for tomorrow night. Chris Godowski is our superintendent. He will be a presenter and a panelist. And then the other presenter and panelists that we have for you this evening are Pat Hamilton, our Chief Operating Officer, Stacy Gahagan, who's our Security Services Director, Priscilla Strawn, our Chief Academic Officer, and Mila Shepard, who serves as our Chief Human Resources Officer. And again, I'm Tracy Dorland, Deputy Superintendent, Facilitator, and I'll moderate the panel for you tonight. And so here's how it's going to work. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. The only people that you will see on the Zoom screen are the board members, staff presenters, and myself. Everybody else who's participating is not on the screen, but we're hopeful that you are watching and using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Your questions, once you submit them, will be read by a small but mighty group of staff members behind the scenes who are collecting all questions and then prioritizing them for me to ask the panelists. We may not get to every question tonight. we did not get to every question last night. But we will be publishing an FAQ with questions probably that we do get to, and some questions that we don't get to this evening. And so we know that those questions you ask are important, and we're going to be trying to answer those as soon as possible. In fact, I will also mention that we believe your questions allow us to know what's on your mind, and it can also help us understand in January or February what other topics we might want to begin talking about if we continue with town halls going into next semester. So please ask away. Those questions give us a lot of information, and we would encourage you to ask questions all throughout the presentation. You do not have to wait for the presentation to be finished. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. I'm going to hand it over to Jamie Lockley and Kathy Plomer, who are going to welcome you this evening.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be the speaker for the board. Jamie is having some technical issues remaining on, so I'll be kind of talking for the board. We are really looking forward tonight to listening to you all. We consider this a really critical night to hear feedback about the proposals for starting school second semester. So just some thoughts to share before we get started. We really do have a common goal with many of the parents and families we've heard from of getting students back to school in a safe and consistent way. We have heard so many stories from parents and students about their experiences with remote learning, and Tracy kind of acknowledged already the challenges that people are having and the struggles, and people just want the best for their kids, and they're really figuring out this remote learning environment, the back and forth. This has been a really tough fall, and we acknowledge that, and we thank you for working with us. In addition to some of the struggles, we've also heard from parents with amazing stories about things that have happened in their classroom and how their teachers have been working with them. So we know this has been just an up and down fall in so many ways. And we're happy to have you here tonight. We do want to hear your thoughts, your preferences, how things are going, and we just want to express our true thankfulness for your support of us during this time. And we are looking forward to tonight's conversation. We want to build a common understanding of kind of the challenges and work through some solutions tonight for a great second semester. So thank you all for all you're doing to be teachers at home and support your kids' teachers with what they're trying to do, and for all your feedback to the Board of Education. We do read it, we take everything very seriously, and we're just happy to join you tonight so we can be listeners to what's going on and what you would like to see coming forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Before we move to the next slide, I just want to break protocol a tiny bit. And there are some questions, and it came up last night. I wish I would have addressed it on the front end. People are asking, I know this is about in-person learning and quarantine for in-person. Is there still going to be a remote option next semester? I don't want you to sit through this presentation and be wondering that, if that's a question you have. The answer to that question is yes. There will continue to be a fully remote option for families who so desire next semester. As you know, we do have many parents who want in-person option. And so this presentation is mostly about the challenges with in-person operationally and some strategies the district is employing to get in-person back up and running in January and as soon as possible next semester. So we will be talking mostly about that, but I just want you to know there will continue to be a remote option. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over and introduce my colleague, Pat Hamilton. Pat serves as our Chief Operating Officer, and he has been in charge of our COVID operations and safety team. Want to just welcome Pat Hamilton and thank him for being here tonight.
Thank you, Tracy. It's my pleasure, and thank you everyone who's joined us tonight. I'm having a few problems sometimes freezing up tonight, so hopefully that won't happen while I'm doing my presentation. So I thought it'd be important to start out talking about the health guidance and how that works for public schools and how actually it comes about. and who the agencies are that are in charge of that. So just a high-level overview is the CDC provides guidance to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. From there, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment create COVID mandates and guidance for the state. That guidance is administered by local health departments. In our case, it's Tri-County Health Department and Broomfield Public Health. The local health agencies then, they help the schools, childcare settings, and other parts of their communities adhere to those state mandates and guidelines. So I think that's important to frame the conversation as we get going here. Next slide, please. So, sorry, I'm gonna have to make one adjustment. What we're seeing here is this is the most recent guidance that we've received from Tri-County Health Department on the 16th of November. This is a lot. There's a lot of links here. And the one thing I want to say is that we are going to provide, there's a couple of key links here that we'll provide to you in some follow-up that you can go down and find most of these links in. But again, this is an example of some of the guidance that we've received recently with some of the updates that we're going to be talking about tonight. I would draw your attention to a couple of things when you do go and look at this yourself. One of those would be the return to learn algorithm. There's 3 different types of algorithms there based on where we are in the dial, and I'll explain those a little bit more when we go down and look at the dials. And then who is a close contact? Those are really the 2 documents that drive our decision-making process, and those are the documents we use when we work collaboratively with Tri-County Health Department and Broomfield Public Health Department on every confirmed, well, just about every confirmed positive case and presumptive positive case. So next slide, please.
Hey, Pat, I'm going to jump in just for 1 second on,
Sure.
on a process piece. For our Spanish speakers who are using interpretation, I do want you all to know that you are welcome to ask a question and in Spanish. We have a staff member who reads Spanish who can help translate your questions if you need to type them in Spanish. So please don't hesitate to type a question in Spanish if that is helpful for you.
Thanks, Tracy. Okay, so this slide, this gives you kind of an overview if you wanted to go really deep into the rabbit hole of that previous slide. This is kind of what you can expect to find, and this is pretty typical for the guidance, the significant guidance updates we receive, and we've received fairly frequently throughout the pandemic, really going back since March. This all really scaled up for us back in July and August when we were trying to figure out how to reopen schools. So you can see in total here, there's about 524 pages of PDF documents and another 650 links within those documents. So it can be a pretty deep rabbit hole if you want to go down there. A lot of those documents are duplicates, and so you'll find that one link is the same as another link talking about the same issue. But every time we get one of these updates, we do have to go through and pour through those documents to make sure that we haven't missed something new in one of those attachments. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference in the dial. So this was a pretty big news story back on November 20th when the state changed it. So towards the end of November, we moved into the red part of the dial during the first semester. We never were issued a stay-at-home order, but we were told as a school district to operate as if we were in the red stay-at-home dial, which when you go and look at those return to learn algorithms, you're going to see that that put a significant, that presented significant challenges to us for operating. So what happened is the state then made a new dial. They updated that dial. So the guidance really has remained the same throughout the dial, but now we have a new color purple. And with that color purple, that allowed us to move back to the algorithm that would be now red. It's still red, but we're using the R2 document in the return to learn algorithm. So that, again, that allows us to kind of go back to the same operating model we were using in October through mid-October until about October 28th. So that will help us in the future operate schools. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we were facing in the first semester as we were in level 2 orange and also level 3 red, we were restricted on our targeted quarantines for elementary schools. So there was no option to use targeted quarantines at any level for our elementary schools. And at our high schools and middle schools, we could only use targeted quarantines if we were in level orange or R2. That ended on 10/27. So once we transitioned out of that, we were already, by the way, in remote with those schools. We lost the ability to do targeted quarantine. Required 10-day isolation. So that was at level red, the previous level red. So if you had a major symptom for more than 24 hours or a minor symptom, or sorry, 2 minor symptoms for more than 48 hours, you were required to do a 10-day isolation. And that was with or without a COVID test. And then anyone who met the definition of exposed to you also had to go into quarantine at that point for 14 days. So very restrictive. And isolation and quarantines could only end with a negative PCR test and an alternative diagnosis for all the symptoms you had when we were in red level 3. And just one quick note too, you'll see at the bottom there, what is exposure? Well, the exposure is defined as if you were within 6 feet of someone for 15 minutes or more over a 24-hour period. And that is why you're wearing masks, by the way. Okay, next slide, please. So this is what our quarantine numbers look like in October versus November. Now, October, we had 22 days of school. We had middle schools and high schools in for the first half of that. We had 65 quarantines, so we were averaging about 3 a day. We transitioned to the high schools and middle schools into remote on October 20th. For the month of November, with just elementary schools in, we had 9 days of schools before we had to go back into full remote, 55 quarantines in that 9 days, which is an average of 6 a day. So quite a heavy lift for us and had a significant impact on our ability to operate our schools. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we anticipate for the second semester and why we think this is going to really help us with operating our schools. So the first semester, we only had the ability to do 14-day quarantines. If you pay attention and watch the media, you probably saw some information about that in the last 2 or 3 weeks where we've changed the quarantine guidance now. So in second semester, we have a couple of different options. So there's a 7-day quarantine and a 10-day quarantine option. The 7-day does have some rules though that apply. So in order to be able to lift your quarantine or move away from quarantine after 7 days, you have to be symptom-free, and you also have to have a negative test. And the negative test has to occur at least 5 days after exposure. So this strategy, that will be an interesting one to see how that plays out. We're very excited about that. We think it gives us some great opportunities. And then there's a 10-day quarantine as well. So again, no symptoms. You cannot have any symptoms in that 10 days. And if you choose not to get a test conducted, any kind of COVID test, whether it be saliva or nasal swab, your quarantine could end after 10 days. So the challenge that brings with it is you could have a situation where you might have to quarantine an entire cohort or an entire classroom, and maybe 2/3 of those students decide to get a COVID test and they test out in 7 days, and the other 1/3 of that class does not do that, and so they would have to go with the full 10 days. So there could be some issues there with how we're going to address that when it happens. This has all happened, these changes have occurred since we've gone into full remote, so something we still have to work through. But we do anticipate that there'll be challenges with implementing these strategies, but we're going to do our best to do that. Other thing is testing. So in the first semester when we were under the older guidance, the previous guidance, if you had a PCR test that was negative, that was accepted for what it was. If you had an antigen test, which is also known as a rapid test, if you had a test like that that was negative, you also had to go get a PCR test before it would be called or considered a confirmed negative. Moving into the second semester, now we can accept a PCR test or an antigen test, which is again the rapid test. Either one of those in a situation where you test negative will be accepted. There will be no requirement to get a second test or a validation test. That's a great help for us as well. I think that's probably everything. Oh, I want to talk about one more thing. So we're also looking at increased testing capacity for the second semester at the schools. So what that means for us is we are looking at trying to bring rapid saliva tests. We're working with our partners at COVID Check Colorado to try to, and other metro districts to try to figure out how we can bring more testing to our community and specifically for our students and staff. That will be a key thing for us opening. Next slide, please. We've seen some changes a little bit in the space of personal protective equipment. You'll hear me refer to it as PPE throughout the presentation. So in the previous guidance, there really wasn't specific guidance on if teachers should wear a KN95 mask or paper mask and a face shield. There was recommendations, but not specific guidance. That has transitioned now where we have recommendations for some sort of face mask and a face shield together. We are often asked how much supply does the district have on hand. We strive to have a 2-week supply of KN95 masks and face shields in every school, as well as a 1-month supply in our central warehouse. So that's something that we will continue to try to do. We do expect to have a little bit of a run on those things when we come back in person, but we are preparing for that by trying to build up those stocks and those supplies now. One thing that we think might be helpful as well is that there is some guidance that talks about if a teacher is wearing a KN95 mask and a face shield and has not been within a sick person for 15 minutes or more within 6 feet, there's a very good chance that that teacher will not have to go into quarantine. So that's another positive change for us that will help us operate schools. One thing I want to mention too is the reason that we're seeing these changes come about is this is a direct result of lots of advocacy and conversations that we've had with our local public health authorities, with the state health department, and in Chris's case, even directly with the governor to talk about these are the operational changes that we really need to have happen for us to be able to operate schools in person second semester. So these didn't just come about on their own. It was a lot of advocacy from district leadership and all the districts across the state to get these changes in place. So now we're going to transition to Stacy Cahagan, who's our Director of Security Services, and she's going to run through a couple of scenarios with you to kind of help you understand how this works in the real world.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Pat had said, I'd like to walk through 2 separate scenarios just to kind of outline the work that the district's COVID response team is doing to align with current and past public health guidance. So Tate is a first grader who attends a local elementary school. He attended school on Tuesday and he felt fine. He had a normal day. He went to his classroom, had music class, ate lunch with his classmates, and spent some time in the library. Wednesday, Tate woke up with a runny nose and a little cough. Dad thought it was a little cold and just sent him to school. By mid-morning, he was taken to the health aide's office and he was sent home. By Thursday, Tate had a low-grade fever. His dad thought he just had a cold, but by Thursday evening, Tate was complaining about feeling worse. Tate's dad called him in sick on the attendance line at the school and scheduled an appointment with the doctor on Friday. Due to the fact that Tate is exhibiting major COVID-like symptoms for greater than 24 hours, the information Tate's dad left on the attendance line would generate an intake form that would be sent over to our district COVID nurses. The district COVID nurse would reach out to the family to check in on Tate and to provide some public health recommendations. The nurse would ask the family to notify her how Tate is feeling and if Tate is tested for COVID. On Saturday, Tate's family does receive notification that he tested positive for COVID. When the nurse reaches out to a family, really her primary goal is to check in with the family to make sure they're doing okay. Everybody receives that information differently and everybody responds to being positive differently. So we want to make sure primarily, that everybody's doing fine. But we also have some questions that we want to ask to determine family dynamics and to determine if there's a potential exposure at the school. So we will ask questions around who the student may have contact with, who lives in the household that may attend an Adams 12 school, just to help us frame this a little better. Under the old R3 guidance that Pat spoke about, the family would be placed in quarantine for 14 days, and the student that is positive would be placed in isolation for 10. If the family's unable to isolate from their child, and in this case, Tate is a very young student, it's very challenging to actually have him in isolation, then the family would be in quarantine for a total of 24 days. And that's because there is a requirement that the family's last day of exposure is the child's last day in isolation. So that's why it gets extended. Once the nurse has determined that there's been an exposure to the school, the nurse will consult with one of the workplace coordinators or public health to determine the scope of the exposure and the type of quarantine that we'll need to do for close contacts. COVID workplace coordinators will review the information received in the intake form, and they'll consult the nurse who spoke with the family. And in some cases, the workplace coordinator will reach out to our public health partners to coordinate for an appropriate response. This slide here demonstrates a line of events. Once we determine that there's been an exposure to the school, we need to look at the date the symptoms began. In this scenario, Tate started getting sick on Wednesday. Tate would be contagious for 48 hours prior to symptom onset. So we need to look at all close contacts on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. More often than not, we are notified of a positive case within 5 to 7 days after the exposure occurred. This results in staff members and students being at school for several days after they've already been exposed. When determining who's a close contact at an elementary school level, we look at the entire classroom based on old guidance. The standard for close contact, as Pat mentioned, again, is within 6 feet of someone for 15 minutes or greater, and that is cumulative. With our youngest students, it's really difficult to track their interactions with other classmates, even with assigned seating. Our little ones tend to move about. So public health guidance at the elementary level under our old R3 is to quarantine the entire class. Now with our new guidance moving forward, it will allow us at all grade levels to conduct targeted quarantine. A targeted quarantine allows us to look at those students who are sitting within 6 feet of the affected child for 15 minutes or greater. Targeted quarantine will require the enforcement of assigned seating in all classrooms and in the cafeteria, and we'll have to monitor those children very closely when they're out at recess as well. By using this approach, schools will be able to retain more staff and students when classmates or staff members become ill or test positive for the virus. In this situation, let's kind of review our numbers here. So under the old guidance, Tate is in a cohort, and that's his first grade class. And there's 21 students in his class, and there's 2 staff members that were in the classroom, his teacher and a para. They all would be placed in quarantine. Tate and his class also attended music that day, on one of those days. And because the class stayed cohorted, we don't have additional students introduced into the quarantine, but we do have an additional staff member, which is the music teacher that would be quarantined. So 21 students and 3 staff members under the old guidance. So looking at the new guidance under targeted quarantine, we would look at Tate's classroom and we would identify what students were sitting immediately around Tate within the 6 feet. And we would work with the teacher to determine if she had close contact with Tate that met the criteria as well. So the numbers in the classroom alone would be greatly reduced. However, we do have to consider that Tate attended a music class. And under both guidances, the old and the new, there is a section that talks about no high-risk activities, singing, wind, brass instruments, or vigorous exertion. If those are to occur, then we are required then to quarantine the entire class. So in this case, because he attended music class during those 3 days, instead of an art class, the class would be quarantined. If Tate's class had gone to art and the art teacher was the one who was sick and the art class had a seating chart, the teacher stayed at the front of the room, then maybe we would just have that targeted quarantine, the art teacher and 5 or 6 students under the new rule. But those 5 or 6 students will be home during the quarantine period without any live instruction opportunities. So you can see that even though it's more ideal to have targeted quarantine, it's still going to present some challenges that we'll have to work through. Other considerations that we look at when we are identifying close contacts is we have to determine if the student attends BASE or PEAK, the before and after school program. Depending on staffing levels and how they are able to cohort the groups in the before and after school program, we would see additional students that would have to be required to be quarantined. The same is true for a bus. If the student is using our transportation, then we would have to, with our old guidance, you'd potentially be looking at 4 to 10 students that would be quarantined, and then at least 2 staff members, the driver and the assistant. And if the student participated in extracurricular activities, and in this case, let's say a football team, the entire team and all the coaches would have to be quarantined because of that criteria I mentioned earlier about it being identified as a high-risk activity. Our next scenario, Titus is an 11th grade high school student. While in class on Friday morning, he started getting a headache. His headache continued on Saturday and he started having body aches. After the football game, Titus's mom took him to Waterworld to get a COVID test. On Monday, his mom notified the school that her son had tested positive. The health clerk completed the intake form and submitted it to our COVID nurse. The COVID nurse goal, again, is to make sure that everybody in the household is doing okay. The nurse reviews the isolation and quarantine dates with the family and then answers any questions that they may have. She will notify the workplace coordinator of a possible exposure to the school for determining quarantining close contacts. Once the workplace coordinator receives the information from the nurse, they will reach out to the principal and start determining who's in that close contact criteria. A lot of times the principal will reach out to that student. Of course, we look at that as an age-appropriate contact, right? As they're older, it's more appropriate. They can identify who they're with. And in this case, Titus attended 6 classes. And on Thursday and Friday, he went to lunch with 3 of his friends. After school, he went to football practice and played in the football game on Saturday. So once we've identified who all of these individuals are, the principal will populate a form called a contact list. That contact list is used for our communications department in collaboration with our school administrators to send out a message to the families regarding the quarantine with a quarantine date and guidelines. So here again, we're going to look at the timeline of events, starting with the day the symptoms began, which is Friday, and go back 48 hours. But because Titus continued to attend classes and football practice and the game, while he was symptomatic, you'll see that we have to look at all close contacts for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Let's review our numbers. Next slide, please. So he attended 6 classes, 15 students per class, which is what our average is for our groups that are hybrid. So that's 90 students quarantined under old guidance, 6 classroom teachers, 1 para. On Thursday and Friday, the friends that he went to lunch with would be quarantined. After school on Friday, he went to football practice and played in the game. So all team members and all coaches would be quarantined. So in this case, it would be a significant quarantine for the school, 138 students and 12 staff. Under our new guidance, under targeted quarantine, We would be looking at only staff and students who are within the 6 feet of Titus for 15 minutes or greater. So those students in the classrooms, and especially at the high school where our students are really spread out in the classroom because there's only 15 or so in that classroom, we really saw an opportunity to greatly reduce those numbers. The teachers as well could be greatly reduced. However, with our football team and our coaches, because of the vigorous exertion, meeting that criteria for enhanced contact identification, they would still need to be quarantined. And his friends, because they were in close contact with him, they would be quarantined. But you could see the number of students greatly would be reduced under the new guidelines. I hope going through these typical scenarios was beneficial in helping you understand some of the dynamics. And these really are typical scenarios, but every one of these scenarios has many, many, many variables. And as Pat mentioned earlier, it requires us to go through a lot of public health guidance, consulting with our public health partners, and really teasing out what that 15 minutes looks like. So again, I hope this was helpful, and thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Really appreciate those case studies. I think they highlight some of the complications and the challenges, as well as some of what we believe the revised guidance will support us with, but just also the fact that it will continue to be challenging and a case-by-case basis in terms of the circumstance we're dealing with into next semester. And so we're hopeful to leverage some of the adjustments to make our operations more smooth next semester. And we hope you understand what some of those adjustments will be. We also want you to know there will continue to be some challenges as we head in. So it can't just be the quarantine guidance and the adjustments to that guidance that we rely on for coming back to in-person learning next semester. We also are working on additional strategies to support second semester learning. You can see those here. We have some adjustments to the hybrid model, which we know is very challenging for staff as well as students and families. That's for our 6th through 12th grade students. We have targeted school-based shifts to remote learning, an effort to target that shift to remote for a couple of weeks if necessary for an individual school, but not hopefully the whole district that we're working on. And we have some ongoing staffing strategies that our Chief HR Officer, Mila Shepard's going to speak with you about. Finally, Pat Hamilton already talked with you a little bit about increase in testing strategies and an increase in consideration of requirements around staff personal protection equipment, given the new revised guidelines. So let's jump into the hybrid model and hear from Priscilla Strawn, our Chief Academic Officer, about what those adjustments will look like.
Good evening. So as Tracy mentioned earlier, in addition to continuing to provide a full online model, we are making some adjustments at the middle and high school level with hybrid learning. To be specific, in-person hybrid classes will now have both in-person and remote students learning the same content at the same time simultaneously. So what that means is regardless of where you are, whether you are seated in the classroom or seated at home at your kitchen table, you will be engaged with your classroom teacher and with your peers as they sit either in the classroom or at home at their kitchen table. All students in our middle and our high school in the hybrid in-person option will have 2 days of in-person instruction and 2 days of remote synchronous instruction as they log on. And Wednesdays will be an asynchronous opportunity for identified students to be able to get additional help from their teacher. That could be office hours. It could be a teacher identifying students that maybe he or she is worried about their diminished engagement, diminished finalizing work products. Maybe they're a student who's normally actively engaged with their screen on and utilizing the chat box, and all of a sudden they've become very quiet and their camera has gone off and the teacher's worried about them. It could be a teacher has some expectations that any student who has a D or lower in the class comes in and spends time on those Wednesday mornings. But really, we believe that the adjustment in this model will provide more consistency and more predictability for our students and our staff, and that will lead to higher levels of engagement and better levels of learning.
Thank you, Priscilla. Pat, let's talk a little bit about targeting necessary shifts to remote learning.
Sure. So this is a question that started coming up towards the last couple of weeks that we were in session or in person. That last few weeks, we actually started to have to close some schools as a result of operational challenges that we were facing due to a high number of cases and also quarantines happening in schools. So during that time, we drafted a document that we are going to share out on the district's website sometime in January, early January. We'll get that out. And we're still drafting the documents right now for middle school and high school. There's still some engagement that we're doing since those schools were already in remote. At that point, we had not had to deal with that from an operational standpoint. So the high level overview of this is that for elementary schools, we look at when they're at 30%. So if they have 30% of their staff or 30% of their student body gone as a result of being in quarantines or actually in isolation as a result of positive COVID test, that's when we start to consider closing down that school temporarily for a few weeks to let us get caught back up with the staffing model. Now, there's things that will impact that. So if we had several schools out for quarantines and lots of staff being impacted, and therefore we deplete our sub pool, we might not even make it to 30%. So we do have to look at these and monitor these each and every school, and also see how that coincides with our sub pool and available adults to supervise kids. So you'll see that guidance out publicly available to us, to everyone here sometime in January.
Great, thanks. And now we're going to hear from Mila Shepard, our Chief Human Resources Officer, about staffing and strategies that we are employing to support the staffing challenges we have.
Good evening. As you've been hearing through the presentation, challenges followed by our strategies to support student needs, and our challenges in the area of staffing are well publicized. You're probably aware of the fact that substitute teachers are hard to find. You may not be aware that in Adams 12, 28% of our typical subpool is comprised of retirees. And usually they're retired teachers from Adams 12. And so those people are not willing to come into the schools given the increased risk for their age bracket. And so right away to begin the year, we were down in number of available subs. We also had some issues with shortages of staff members related to leaves of absence. Many people felt the need to take a leave of absence, and some of the numbers are on the screen there. Quarantines that Pat mentioned and Stacy went through. Every time a staff member needed to be quarantined, finding an adult to supervise and be in the classroom was a challenge. As we go out into our community and advertise for positions, we found that in a typical autumn time frame in a previous year, we would have hired about 165 new substitute teachers. This year, during that same time frame, we were only able to hire about 75. So for whatever reason, people are not willing to apply for and become substitute teachers in schools right now. And many of them have their own children at home to take care of, and there are a lot of other reasons. And so we have done some things to try and overcome the challenges during first semester, and we will continue these efforts. But among them are the creation of a new opportunity for classified staff members. We have paraeducators and people in schools who would be willing to serve as a substitute teacher. And so the district has paid for the process to be licensed and trained to become an emergency substitute teacher. 28 of our classified staff members at 19 locations have already obtained that emergency sublicense and are ready to serve in that capacity. We've had 55 new applications for substitute teachers. We've done some increased advertising and have seen a little bit of response to that. We also created a new position called classroom monitor that is when we do have a teacher who's out on quarantine trying to teach remotely, someone has to be in the classroom with the children. And so classroom monitor position was created. And we have had 20 new applications for classroom monitors, but more than that, we've had existing classified staff members, bus drivers, nutrition workers, student monitors who aren't full-time say, I'll take on some extra hours. I will serve as a classroom monitor. And so far we've had 186 employees serve 6,400 hours as classroom monitors during first semester. So we're really trying to use every resource in every way we know how. We do advertise extensively and strategically. We utilize a number of recruiting platforms, jobbing.com, which is a website that specializes in online recruitment in the Denver metro area. We use Indeed, which is one of the largest recruiting platforms around the world, 250 million visitors every month to Indeed.com. We use Adams County Workforce and a website called Connecting Colorado. That's a state and county run system. There are 69,000 jobs posted on that every month. We use diversityjobs.com. That's a recruiting service with 500,000 active job seekers who they're a niche website that tries to connect diversity-friendly employers with all people of color, and also women, veterans, people with disabilities, older workers, and members of the LGBTQIA plus community. So we use K-12 JobSpot, which is a national teacher candidate recruitment spot. And we visit universities all over the country, strategically selected to give us what we need in terms of our staffing. So you in the community, I would encourage those of you who are on tonight to visit our website, the Adams 12 webpage, go to the careers button and take a look at our job postings. We are hiring substitute teachers and classroom monitors right now. I would encourage any of you who have the time, the willingness, the ability to apply to do so and come and be part of the solution for second semester. And if it's not you, please pass the word. Help me deputize you to be a recruiter for us. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time here tonight.
Okay, so now we are going to just review kind of the proposed second semester plan that was communicated to our community on Monday and that we're here to talk about tonight. So with that, I will hand it over to Superintendent Godowski and he'll run us through this and then we'll start our Q&A.
Thank you, Tracy. So to this point, you've heard a whole lot of technical information that's super relevant. It does matter in terms of operational viability and how we manage school and make it a safe and productive experience. And yet in the end, when you get to a place of decision making, there have been three bigger buckets or principles that have driven my decision making and my recommendation to the board about how we approach second semester. The first lens relates to safety, and it's imperative that we provide a safe work and learning environment for our students and staff and community members who are visiting our schools. And I feel like we're in a place of greater confidence that as we head into second semester and we look at having in-person opportunities, that we can do that in a safe way. Some of the why behind that, a first piece is that there's been a lot of data collected throughout the region about how many students and staff who've been placed in quarantine subsequently contract the virus, most likely because of a school exposure. And that data has shown, and it's been analyzed very extensively by public health officials through the Metro Denver Partnership for Health that includes representatives from the Tri-County region, Denver, Boulder, Jeffco, that they've seen less than a 1% transmission rate within a school setting from students to one another or to staff. And so they see very low incidence of transmission in the school setting. The public health officials are describing that as a very small incremental risk beyond what they see just in the inherent risk that each of us have in our day-to-day interactions in the community. So one is low transmission. The second piece is that we've concluded that there can be some changes made to quarantine standards without sacrificing the safety of students and staff. I have shared in a variety of settings a data point that I first heard Dr. Douglas from Tri-County Public Health share in June, which is the data they were seeing at that juncture, both from a national and largely international community, was that 95% of the individuals who are exposed to COVID, according to these studies in the summertime, would contract COVID, if at all, within 5.1 days following exposure. And after hearing that, I've asked and I pushed, and I've been in a variety of meetings with public health directors, with CDPHE, with the governor's advisors, and others, saying that if 95% of the individuals who are going to contract COVID do so within 5.1 days, isn't necessary to do 14-day quarantines to capture and protect against a very small risk. And what you've seen recently is that the CDC and then our state has revised that 14-day standard down to the 7 to 10-day standard that you've heard about tonight. So I feel like that's a change that allows us to keep many more of our staff in our schools working to serve students in person without posing unnecessary safety risks to our staff. In fact, there's some more recent data that CDPHE has published and that Dr. Douglas has shared with me that indicates after a negative PCR or antigen test on day 7, the risk that that individual who's been tested and who is in quarantine and who is exposed, the risk of them transmitting COVID to someone else is in the 4 to 5.5% range, depending on what type of test they took. And they know after day 10 that the risk of that person who's been in quarantine unknowingly transmitting COVID to somebody else on the return to school, that risk is between 0.3% and 1.1%. So these revisions to the quarantine duration are ones that I'm convinced, given what has been shared with me by public health officials, don't pose any meaningful risk at all to our staff and our students. And likewise, they give us significant improvements in terms of how long our staff in particular need to be out if they've been exposed, so we can have some greater continuity in person. So that's a second piece that makes me feel very much assured about where we stand with these revised quarantine standards, and that they're going to give us more flexibility in terms of operations without increasing the safety risk. Similar kinds of things that I can share about the alternative diagnosis piece. That was a part of the initial standards, that even if you had a negative PCR test, you had to go to a doctor and have them say that your sore throat, your headache, your symptoms were for something other than COVID. A lot of our students and families weren't able or willing to get that kind of alternative diagnosis. And the good news is now a negative test will often be the ticket for those non-symptomatic students and staff members to return to school. So that's helpful. And then likewise, what you've heard from Pat earlier tonight is in prior parts of this guidance, if somebody, if they contracted COVID and we had an exposure when the rates were higher in our community, we had to do these larger cohort-based quarantines where we'd be sending out 30 to 130 students at a time, and anywhere from typically 3 to a dozen staff members. That guidance too has been revised so that we can do targeted quarantine even in those cases. And the why behind that is that the data they've seen not only here locally, but throughout our state and our country indicates that even when you have a higher incidence rate of COVID within the community, the likelihood of greater risk of transmission between students and staff in a school setting when that's going on does not seem to increase at all. And so that's the reason why they've made those changes, and why I feel like adopting those standards allows us to have a safe return to school and a more productive and fully staffed environment in which we do it. So the safety lens has been an important lens for me to look through. A second lens that's driven this recommendation is the interest in consistency. There's been very little that I've seen agreement on between any one group of people, whether it's parents, students or staff. There are differences of opinion within groups, certainly, and between groups, sometimes even more so in terms of disagreement about what we should do. The one exception to that label of a season of discontent and disagreement is that I've heard consistently from all three groups their interest in consistency, not coming back in person and then going out to remote, not blowing schools out for 2 weeks because huge numbers of staff are on quarantine. And what students have been very passionate and advocating to me is, don't have us moving back and forth. We understand that we may have quarantines at our school if we're back in person. There may be occasions that something really unfortunate happens and we have so many of our staff out or so much of our student body out that we have to do a 2-week transition remote. But don't bring us back in a spot where that's widespread and likely to happen at high levels, such that the whole system needs to transition to remote again. And so consistency is an important part of the recommendation here. And it relates very strongly to this third leg, which is operational viability and what we've learned from our fall experience. The revised guidance from the Metro Denver Partnership for Health that was published today acknowledges what they've seen throughout this metro region, which is when case incidence hits the 500 to 700 level, that's when schools consistently see too many staff members go out on quarantine, and notwithstanding our best efforts to leverage staff from other roles and responsibilities within a school or from other parts of our system to fill in those spots and to get as many subs in as we can across many, many districts throughout this region. At the 500 to 700 level, we've seen that it becomes not viable. We just don't have enough staff to even provide supervision of students, much less a high quality supportive educational environment. You see some variation in that 500 to 700 range between districts. It often turns upon how much staffing they have. So some school districts in this metro region have quite a bit more money than others. Much of it that's come in some communities through supplemental elections to operate their schools more robustly. So some districts have more staff deployed to elementary, middle, or high than others. That can be a piece that makes a big difference. A second piece that makes a big difference is your substitute teaching pool. I think throughout the metro region, we're challenged in that space, but some districts have more parents in particular who've been willing to step into that space and help out. And then a third important consideration is how many of your staff currently are needed to serve students in a remote setting because students and families have made that choice. Throughout Adams 12, 30 to 40% of our students, depending on the level, have selected remote learning for first semester. We've actually seen a slight increase in demand for remote learning at the high school level for second semester. And if you have a large number of your staff serving students in a remote setting, when you start to have lots of quarantine activity at the school level, they're not available to fill in, to cover classes, to substitute and patch things through. So that's the why behind some of that variation across the metro region, but consistently 500 to 700, that range has been the breaking point that we've seen throughout the system. And so what I've tried to do is to look at that experience, look at case rates that we had in the fall, to look at our current case rates now, to confer with public health about what they believe to be likely in January, and then to lay out some of these dates that you see in the slide here. What we've seen is that in our experience in Adams 12, we started to have tremendous challenge in operating our secondary schools even lower than 500 cases per 100,000. It was around 350 cases per 100,000 where we were having too many different learning support systems going on for our students that were requiring our teachers to go in too many directions. We're very optimistic that given a number of the changes that have been reviewed tonight, including the simultaneous instruction adaptation, that we'll be able to withstand a higher case rate incidence than the 350 that we had before. And yet we know that for a good bit of the October, November, December timeframe, we've been well beyond that. Soon after October 21st, we started this rise from that 500 case rate per 100,000 level, and we peaked at about 1,460 cases per 100,000 around Thanksgiving. I'm grateful to say that the Thanksgiving surge and spike further on top of those numbers that many anticipated has proven not to be the case thus far. And as I look at today's data, it's the best it's been in over a month. We're down to a positivity rate of 1,027.1 as of today's data in Adams County. That's a tremendous improvement even over where it was yesterday. So I have a lot of hope and optimism that if we continue to manage the virus and our interactions and social settings in the way that it appears that we did through Thanksgiving, that we can find ourselves in a spot by this mid to late January timeframe where we do have case rate incidents at or around 500 and trending in a consistently downward level that will give us confidence that we can sustain in-person operations and meet what our parents, students, and staff all say is important: consistent, enduring in-person schooling. So those are some of the key data points that have led to the slide in front of you. As we come back in early January, my recommendation is that we spend the first 3 days getting our teachers equipped to do the work of second semester and to adapt to these changes in learning model that's been described. In particular at the secondary level, using some of this live streaming capability and learning how the technology works, and then having time to practice that without students so that you work the bugs out and you can then start to plan the best quality instruction that you can will take some time. And even at the elementary level, our educators indicate that they'd like to have time to learn from colleagues, to reflect on some of the tools and tactics they use first semester and have a chance to improve them and make it a better set of learning tools for second semester. And so under this recommendation, the first 3 days we'd focus on professional development. We'd look to start our remote learning on January 7th, that Thursday, and do that system-wide. Bring a very small group of students back, our special needs students who have the most significant needs, and start to bring them back January 11th for in-person learning. And then also do at that same time some assessment of our second language learners. There's a test called Access that helps us figure out how those students are progressing in their acquisition of English. And we would start to administer that starting the week of January 11th. We have quite a number of our Spanish-speaking students who are remote. It's in the 40% range system-wide. And so having a chance to do the testing for those students before we return into in-person and have larger numbers present will also be a benefit. And then the final piece of this plan and proposal would be to come back in person on January 25th system-wide. As I said before, now that we're at a range of about 1,000 cases per 100,000 in Adams County, I'm hopeful that we can make the improvements necessary by that time in January, that we're down around the 500 case rate per 100,000, that we can have operational viability, safety, and then launch into this consistent in-person learning at that time. So those are some of the key parts behind the why and the thinking about this proposal to the board that I'll be sharing again with them tomorrow night. I hope this has been helpful. I think we're now going to transition into the panel piece and responding to your questions. So I'll look to Tracy to take over and facilitate that portion for us.
Great, thank you, Chris. And so for everyone to know, our panel members who are now going to turn their screens on, if they haven't already, are Chris Godowski, our superintendent, Pat Hamilton, who you've heard from, Chief Operating Officer, Mila Shepard, who's our Chief Human Resources Officer, Priscilla Strawn, our Chief Academic Officer, and Stacy Gahagan, who's in charge of our security services. And so those will be the folks who answer your questions. I'll facilitate. And we have organized some questions here to kick us off. So let's begin. The first question is, and Chris, this probably is a good question for you. It's been 9 months since the start of remote learning. There are private schools that are still open full time. There are charter schools that only went remote 2 weeks ago. The governor of Texas has had an order that schools must remain open. Why is it that Adams 12 cannot get on board and be as proactive? The common denominator is the school board and the teachers union. If any of you truly cared about these students, you would have been working day and night with Polis, CDPHE, Tri-County Health, et cetera, to revise the guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. So as I mentioned before, day and night, probably not day and night, but we've certainly worked daily, weekly, consistently with the governor, including a call that I had with him, was invited to be a part of before Thanksgiving to advocate further for changes to quarantine standards that were then made in short order afterwards. Have been in countless conversations with the governor's COVID advisor, with the CDPHE staff, with Dr. Herlihy, the state epidemiologist, with Dr. Douglas, Jason Volling, the Metro Denver Public Partnership for Health group, all about these issues that I've talked about before. And so the advocacy around changes to quarantine standards has been longstanding. And I would submit to you that even though it took longer to get to the place that I felt like it should, the advocacy was successful. And so we're pleased about some of those changes. In terms of private schools and charter schools, I don't know all of what is going on in Adams County with our private schools. I do know what's going on with our charter schools. And so let me share a little bit more about what's happened in that space. We have 7 charter schools within Adams 12. 4 of them are chartered by our district and are accountable to our Board of Education. 3 of them are chartered by the State Charting School Institute and accountable to them. They have independent boards of directors. They're not unionized. They have different leadership teams that are free to develop whatever schooling models they see are best fit to serve their students and their community. And so what I've seen across those 7 schools is that all 7 of them, as we headed into Thanksgiving break, were in a remote stance, just as we were. And frankly, the 4 schools that I know best are Prospect Ridge, Stargate, Westgate, and New America that are chartered by us. Out of that 4, Prospect Ridge Academy had 1 day of in-person schooling at the high school level. Stargate moved their entire elementary system to remote on the Halloween weekend, a week to 2 weeks before we made the same decision system-wide for Adams 12. Westgate, similar kind of decision. They transitioned their entire system to remote before we did. New America has been in a remote stance the entire semester. So to suggest that an unwillingness to return to in-person is driven by our Board of Education or by our teachers union, I think flatly ignores the facts of what's gone on within our community over the last number of months. What doesn't come into play, and some of what was in the question that you shared there, Tracy, from that constituent, is that Adams County has had far and away higher numbers of incidents than other places in the metro region. Given those quarantine standards, we have numerous quarantines that we're managing. And one of the pieces that can be really deceptive in some of the data that we've shared with you is even if you have 6 quarantine situations emerging each and every day, as we did in early November, and 30 new quarantines a week, it's hugely burdensome to do all the contact tracing, communication, and quarantine implementation. But what's missing in that data is that so many of those quarantines were taking out 6 staff members, 8 staff members, a dozen staff members at a time. And so we went in some schools like Stellar Elementary from having not a single quarantine that they had gone through to having more than 30% of their staff out in a week's time. So I would submit to the person who submitted this question that the challenges that have come with in-person learning and our start with remote, which was driven by what public health was recommending at the time, and our transition back to remote, which was driven by extensive quarantine activity that we were grappling with, isn't a byproduct of our Board of Education. It's not a byproduct of our union. In fact, it's the exact same sort of decision-making that happened with our 7 charter schools within our community over the last couple of months.
Great, thank you, Chris. This next question I think should be directed for Priscilla. It's how does the district plan to address the other side of remote learning? Emotional health, mental health, feeling isolated from peers. Physical health has obviously been top priority, but we've not done great at addressing these other issues that our students are facing.
So at the beginning of the fall semester, we sent out a survey to all of our families and our students at the elementary and middle level. Parents were encouraged to answer the survey with their student, and at the high school level, students were allowed to answer the survey on their own. We were just looking at age appropriateness. We had over 12,000 responses to that. And what we were trying to identify with that is, as students were transitioning back into the school year, where were they in regard to their social emotional health? What were the impacts of the pandemic and the isolation? And really what we learned was that, one, for the most part, students really missed their friends. They did feel isolated. Many of them felt that their relationships with their families had increased. Many of them believed that they had created a new interest or possibly begun to develop a new skill set. We also asked families to let us know whether they needed an individual contact because they were really worried about their student, possibly needing a referral to a mental health provider, and also to reach out to us if they were in need of further supplies, internet connectivity, or just some basic personal supplies. And so from that, we were able to identify a list of students. We made over 2,000 contacts within the first couple weeks back to those individual families. And from that, our mental health providers, our counselors, our social emotional learning specialists have been continuing to double back on those families. Our social emotional learning specialists have been working with classroom teachers, have been identifying, some best practice in how to engage, how to do, belly breathing, some mental health breaks. Our mental health workers and our counselors have been engaging with some small groups. I think there are a lot of behind the scenes things that are happening within our schools. And we know that this is a major concern of our families. And we know that it's an area where we need to continue to get better. And we are in the midst of planning how we will do that.
Great. Thank you, Priscilla. I think this one should probably be answered by you and maybe Chris in terms of special education students with IEPs. How will you be able to legally fulfill your obligations to students' IEPs with this plan going forward? Our students' IEP is not being fulfilled and their progress is significantly behind due to the remote learning situation. Can we respond to how we're going to support our students on IEPs moving forward?
So yes, the special education teachers in our schools are in the midst of building contingency learning plans. So they open up a student's IEP and they work collaboratively with the family to see where the needs are being met and to identify gaps. In support of these teachers, our special education coordinators at the district level are working with school-based teams and outreaching to families right now to start the limited in-person learning opportunities for our special education students at all levels, elementary, middle, K-8, and high school, for those services to begin on January 11th. And during that time, as students return, IEPs will be reviewed and IEP team meetings will be convened as appropriate. It's really important that if you believe that your students' needs are not being met, that you contact their special education teacher so that we can work collaboratively with you to see what you're seeing and what needs you believe are not being met, so that together we can develop the strategies that will address your concerns.
And let me jump onto that too, if I can, Priscilla and Tracy. The other piece I would add is I feel a compelling need for us to add some compensatory services for students as we head into the summer break. There's just been a lot of choppiness in what's happened throughout the last 9 months. Remote learning, notwithstanding the very best efforts of our staff, for a lot of students just are not going to be sufficient to help them move forward. And so, as Priscilla said, we're committed to starting back in person with students with our most significant needs January 11th. We'll do lots of IEP teamwork to listen about how kids are doing, to check in where they're at, and to do the very best we can, ideally in a consistently in-person setting throughout the spring semester. But even with that, I think we're going to need to provide some compensatory services and additional learning opportunities for our kids. And we'll have more information for you about that in the months ahead. It will come at a cost. And And I'm hopeful that as our legislature and the Congress continue to look at some of the pandemic impacts, that they'll realize that there are a lot of gaps that are going to be out there for students throughout our entire country that are going to require more time and more effort and more touch. And having some additional resources to support that effort would be tremendously helpful. But even if it doesn't come, we're going to have to find ways to provide some additional time this summer and beyond to shore up some of the gaps for our special needs students in particular.
Thank you, Chris and Priscilla. Mila, this one's for you. This is about the extended break, the teacher PD days. Is that going to take away our spring break? Will that be extended into the summer? How will the calendar be adjusted?
At this time, there's no plan to change our master calendar, our spring break, our end of the school year calendar dates. We are working with a group of classified employees and certified employees. It's called the Onward Work Group. And we are devising a recommendation so that we can extend from 1 day to 3 days the professional development in January, and do that in exchange for some other in-service days that were already scheduled for February and April. And so we'll just be doing a trade of when these in-service days occur from later in the semester right up to the front end so that we can be ready for a new approach in second semester.
And it's really a total of 2 days that we would be exchanging. Yes. Yes. Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Here's a question about, let's see. There's several questions. I'm going to summarize this one and not read it word for word, because I think there are several that have questions about, I just filled out this survey to select my preference for January. Now I'm getting this information. If I want to change again now, can I? If we come back in January and then case rates surge, can I go back to remote then? If I do those things and I'm able to shift back and forth, or if we do shift as a system next semester from in-person back to remote, will our teachers change again? Because we're concerned about our choice with the fluctuating pandemic rates, and we're concerned about our teachers changing if the district decides to make further changes and having consistencies next semester. So Priscilla, maybe this one's best for you to start with, and then others can add on.
There was a lot in that question,
Yes.
so I'll start and then you can feed me the other parts of the questions that maybe I don't address. So in the survey that we sent out to parents, we identified in that survey that at the elementary level, there were really no adjustments being made. We would still provide the fully online track, and we would still provide the 5-day in-person track. That the adjustments were coming at the secondary level, that there would still be a fully remote track, and that the hybrid in-person model was the one that was being adjusted to provide for more consistency and predictability, so that students in that model would really have a simultaneous instructional experience. So they would no longer have 2 days of in-person and 2 days of asynchronous learning. It would all be synchronous learning simultaneously, whether you're in the classroom or seated at the kitchen table. We did let families know at that point in time that we would do our very best to accommodate their request, but that we did have some things that could prohibit that happening. One would be just class sizes at the elementary level, which are capped at 24. We do have a few situations in certain schools where we've gone to 27 based on square footage in the classroom, but the majority are capped at 24. And we also looked at class sizes in a remote setting and the thresholds that we had set. And so if a family was requesting a change and we were unable to do that because of class sizes, the principal is working with the individual family to talk about what their options are to best try to meet their needs.
Great, that's helpful. And so families basically need to know, if you have serious concerns about the choice you just made, or the choice you made later on in second semester. This question also came from a student, just so you know, which I really appreciate that we have students who have joined us this evening. We know how much you care about your learning experience, and we value your input, and we're glad you're here. And so the direction would be connect with your school and your teachers and have a conversation if you have serious concerns about the learning model that you're headed into in January or at any time during next semester. Our schools are open to conversation about that. So Priscilla, what I would say is this next question is for you, and then we'll do one more, which I think is for Chris, and I want to shift into the live survey. So Priscilla, can you quickly address the question we got last night? I think it's a fair question. If PE and music is such a high risk activity, why are we having those classes?
I think it's a really good question. It's a question that we as a school district have grappled with. It's a question that our specials and elective teachers have grappled with. And the honest answer is we believe in the importance of educating the whole child. What we know is that as a student continues their progression with us from grade level to grade level or level to level, that many students start to develop a passion in a particular area. It could be that they're a gifted athlete. It could be that they have a passion for singing or playing a particular musical instrument. It could be that they're an artist, and it could be that they are interested in the theater. And for them, that passion is what grounds them in their education. Earlier, you heard me talk a little bit about the social emotional pieces of student learning. We know that when we start to eliminate some of those elective courses, that can dramatically and negatively impact a student's engagement in their academics. So we believe that our elective programs matter, and we believe that it is something that our students enjoy and is something that they benefit from, and something that helps prepare them as they determine what their next pathway is as they graduate from Adams 12.
Great. Thank you very much. So Chris, this next question, and it's the last one that we'll get to this evening, is for you. And it's a little bit of a sandwich. And I appreciate that somebody sandwiched it a little bit. So I'm going to read it. And I think you'll appreciate what I just said as I read it. This person says, I really appreciate this opportunity, but I do have a question about this town hall. Is it just a formality to say you checked a box? The plan has been released already, so I'm wondering if any changes will be made by tomorrow. And then at the end, thank you all.
Thanks, Tracy. I appreciate the sandwich too. And I just appreciate the respectful frame, start and beginning, and really a thoughtful, meaty question in the middle. So a few things I would share is that who I am and who I've been, not only as superintendent, but as a school attorney that served a diverse client base and did it really well from an early age. I think what I know about myself is I'm a pleaser and I'm a consensus builder, and I like to find creative ideas and solutions that bring people who want to approach the work from disparate places and interest to a place of commonality. That's who I think I am. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that's the work I've done here in Adams 12 over the last 11 years. And yet I struggle to do that work in this space more than I have in a lot of other settings. So the place I'd love to find is some place that makes the very diverse stakeholders and the parent voice, especially the parent voice who wants us to be back in the saddle in person as quickly as possible, January 4th, January 11th, January 19th, happy. And I have a tough time finding that solution given what I'm not hearing in any of the dialogue I've had last night or in other settings or tonight that changes my belief about what our operational reality has been and will be if we continue to have really high case rates like what we've had through that mid-October through the present day, and how it will be if we continue to be in that space again in January. So it's one thing to say, yeah, gosh, I want to be a pleaser. And if we've got some unhappy parents, let's find a way to make them happy. Let's find a way to make staff happy if they're in a dissatisfied place. All I really see are facts, data, experience, and predictions about the future. And my predictions of the future are largely unchanged, as I've had a press conference today with colleagues from the other 5 large districts in the region and Littleton Public Schools. They've largely been unchanged in dialogue and question and answer last night and today. I still continue to believe that if we have a case rate incidence of 500 or higher or around that amount, especially if it's trending upward or it's unstable, that we won't be delivering what our kids and our parents say they want, which is consistent in person. We will, even with improvements in testing, even with improvements in quarantine standards, even with vaccinations eventually getting out there to our staff, we will have a very choppy, unpredictable, and unsatisfying start to January if we have that case rate incidence. And so the January 25th date that I have is based on my best prediction of the future, given all these consultations with public health officials about what they think is going to happen. They indicate that they don't have a crystal ball either. They've been wrong a couple of, at least 2 to 3 times that I can think of thus far about how it's going to go down. We didn't have the enduring surge that started in July that sustained into August, September, and beyond and overwhelmed our hospitals. We actually started to see a downward trend in late July. We got unpleasantly surprised by a big and fast surge that started in mid-September and continued until Thanksgiving that they weren't predicting either. And now we've had a pleasant surprise in recent weeks that we're not seeing thus far evidence of a Thanksgiving surge and spike. I'd put a caveat next to that, given what the governor said today, that we're seeing a whole lot less testing too. And that's, I think there's still some worry that we might be underestimating what our numbers truly are right now. But given what I know now, a case rate of 1,050, given what we've seen after most of our past holidays, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, and the surges that followed, I continue to believe that January 25th is a responsible time to stake out as a time when we hope and expect that we can provide in person. So it's not a rubber stamp. Listening carefully, I'm just not seeing anything that's coming forward that says managing quarantines will be so much different that we can tolerate 1,000, 1,200 or so case rate and still do it well. So that's my straight answer. I'd love for it to be different. I'd love to find a way to have all 200,000 constituents in this community feeling like they're getting what they want. All 5,000 staff feeling like we're making the decision that supports their interest, and all 32,000 plus parents and students feeling like we've done the same. But I have to pay attention to facts, data, and experience. And to me, I still feel like January 25th is the right way for us to try to step back into this work and sustain it for second semester.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate the honest answer on that question and really appreciate all of these very good and thoughtful questions that you all pose. So thank you to our community who's joined us this evening for the questions. We are going to move into a poll because we do want to know what you're thinking after having heard all of this information, both the technical aspects and then the Q&A conversation. And we want to ask you some questions that we want to be able to represent your perspective to the Board of Education tomorrow night. So let's go ahead and start the poll. This should take 5 minutes. I realize we're a little bit over time. I want to acknowledge that and let you know that we probably have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to read these. You have them on your screen. If you can't find them, I think Raquel might jump in here and help me. There should be a poll button on the bottom of your menu. You might need to hit that for this to launch, but hopefully it's right there in your screen. We sometimes have concerns and issues if people are on an older Chromebook or a Chromebook that doesn't have certain software downloaded. But I'm hoping that most of you can get into the poll. Raquel, do you want to add anything?
Nope, you covered it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read them, but you can go at your pace. You can answer them more quickly than what I'm reading, or you can go slower. I want to read them to help our interpretation for any speakers of other languages. So, number 1, do you feel like you have a better understanding of district COVID quarantine operations now than you did before? That's sort of an assessment of our ability to help explain the challenges that we're facing. So we'll see how we do on that answer to that question. Number two, I want to acknowledge that we received some feedback from participants last night that this question that I'm about to read made people feel uncomfortable. It made people feel like we had a perspective, that we expected a certain answer, and that we were not respectful of, frankly, the first answer here. I just want to say before we read this question that this question, I apologize for it making people feel uncomfortable last night. We went ahead and kept it because we wanted to have consistency between our two sessions. And I want people to know that our intent behind this question is to allow people to express their genuine interest. We know that there are community members out there who want to come back in person regardless of the case rates. We want people to give us that feedback and be able to say that to us. We respect that perspective. We also know that there are people out there that have chosen remote learning because they don't want to come back in person at all. And we know many people are in between those two poles. And so this question is intended to give voice to people who really just want to be back in person. We know people are struggling with remote. We know their students are. And so please know that there was a positive intent behind this question, and there's no right or wrong answer, frankly, around so much of this, including this question. So number two, when thinking about next semester, what is most valuable to you? The first option is returning to in-person learning as soon as possible, regardless of case rates, even if it means students and teachers are frequently in and out of quarantine. In-person learning is more important than consistent and stable learning environments. Or two, returning to in-person learning when case rates provide for more consistency in school operations and sustained in-person learning. Consistency and stability is a top priority, even if it means starting remote. And it's just the crux of a challenge that we're facing. We want to know which choice you would make. Question number three. District leadership has proposed January 25th as a potential date for a return to in-person learning. We did consider other dates. Based on what was presented tonight, what is your preferred date to return to in-person learning for second semester? I support the proposed date of January 25th, or I prefer to return in person earlier on January 19th, or I prefer to wait another week and return to in-person learning on February 1st. By the way, once we complete this poll, we will see the results as a group. Question 4, district leadership has proposed that all grade levels return to in-person learning on the same date. Other districts are proposing a staggered return to in-person learning with elementary beginning before secondary. What do you believe is best? All schools return to in-person learning on the same date, preschool through 12th. Return elementary students first, then secondary students 6th through 12th grade 1 week later. Return elementary schools students first, then secondary students 6th through 12th grade 2 weeks later. And question 5, given the impact to student learning this year, the district will begin planning for additional opportunities to address student learning loss and gaps. What type of opportunities would you be most interested in for summer of 2021? In-person learning opportunities, remote learning opportunities, hybrid learning opportunities with both remote and in-person, self-directed learning opportunities, in-person learning opportunities that include field trips, or none of the above. We want to have a normal summer. And that is our final question. So we'll just wait a moment here until Jody Turner can let me know that it looks like a good majority of our participants have taken the poll and completed it. And then we'll have the results and we'll look through those together and then we'll end our session.
Tracy, it looks like we're about 90% right now. So okay. About 12 people left.
Great. We'll give folks another minute or two to think about their answers and then we'll project the results. Thanks, Jody. As we're doing that, I will just let you all know that there were some questions about COVID testing, and and access for students. Pat mentioned it, but I'll just reiterate, we are in partnership with COVID Check Colorado and collaborating with them now to increase our testing opportunities for both students and staff. That is, and hopefully not at the expense of our families, but we're still working on it, and there will be more information in January about that piece. That's just an effort to answer one more question for you all tonight.
Okay, Tracy, I'm going to leave it up for 25 more seconds. We have one person left, so.
Great. Thanks, Jody. Okay, so here we go. The first question is an assessment of how we did tonight with our outcome of informing you and educating you about the challenges the district's facing operations-wise with the quarantine guidelines. So do you feel like you have a better understanding of district COVID quarantine operations now than you did before? 71% said yes, 22% said somewhat, and 7% said no. I'm reading these because why, Jody? I'm doing this because we want to make sure we can translate, right?
That's correct, because on the YouTube side, the viewers cannot see the poll results.
Oh, thank you. Also, for those of you watching on the YouTube channel, I'm reading those so you can hear. And for our translators, thanks, Jody. Question number 2. So 71% felt like they have a better understanding after tonight's session. I'm glad to hear that. Question 2, when thinking about next semester, what is most valuable to you? 37% reported that returning to in-person learning as soon as possible, even if that means that there is less than consistent operations and stable learning environments. And 63% said returning to in-person learning when case rates provide the opportunity for more consistency with operations and sustained in-person is what they would choose. Question 3. District leadership has proposed January 25th as a potential date for a return to in-person learning. Other dates were considered. Which date would you choose? I support the proposed date of January 25th, was at 31%. I prefer to return in person earlier on January 19th, is at 44%. I prefer to wait another week to return to in-person learning on February 1st, is at 25%. Question 4 is a question about all grade levels starting at the same time or phasing in elementary first, followed by secondary at a later time. 65% want all schools to return to in-person learning on the same date, no staggered approach. 24% of you prefer that elementary students return 1 week earlier than secondary, and 11% of our participants preferred that elementary schools return 2 weeks earlier than secondary. And the final question is really a looking forward question. The district is committed to putting together a plan for supporting learning loss that we know has occurred over the course of late last spring and this year. I do anticipate that plan will go further than this summer and be a longer term plan, but we want to know as we look at this summer what we can begin doing for our families and our students. 22% of participants would like some sort of learning opportunity this summer in person. 6% are interested in something remote. 11% would be open for a hybrid experience this summer. 6% think something self-directed would be helpful. 20% want in-person with a field trip opportunity. And 35% of respondents say none of the above. Our family just wants to have a normal summer. So it's very helpful information for us as we begin planning next semester. Thank you. So that concludes the survey. I think there's a slide about next steps, Betsy, that maybe we could just look at real quick. Yeah, so we will have a board meeting tomorrow night. And you are invited to join that board meeting. And you would hear a synopsis of the feedback that we've heard from you tonight, as well as a presentation of the proposal from Chris. We will continue to prepare classrooms and teachers for the simultaneous instruction for the hybrid model. We are going to continue to collaborate with public health officials on these new quarantine guidelines. We do begin to plan a strategy to provide additional learning opportunities to address learning loss. As we come back in January, that work will begin. And we do plan to stay connected to our community and all of you through ongoing town hall meetings next semester. We value the conversation. We are hopeful as we do this more next semester that we can engage in more two-way conversation. We appreciate your patience this evening with our format. We are happy that we were able to include many more people than we originally expected in these sessions. And we very much appreciate your time, your perspective, and thank you for everything you're doing for your students. We look forward to the board meeting tomorrow night and more engagement next semester. Thank you, and I hope you have a great evening. Chris, do you want to add any last words?
Just my appreciation for spending your evening with us. I know it's been a stressful semester, a frustrating semester. I get it 100% as a parent. I've been a parent now for 28 years, and I've never had a more frustrating stretch in my parenting journey than I've had the last 9 to 10 months. I'm one of the parents, like many of you out there, that would very much love to have our schools back in person January 4th or 5th. And it's been a difficult journey. And so adding on top of long days and a frustrating experience to be here tonight, I know is another ask, but it's appreciated very much. I appreciate the feedback that you've shared here tonight. We'll be sharing that with the board. They'll be wrestling with this information as well. And regardless of where we land, I wish all of you restful holidays, safe holidays, and healthy holidays. I hope we all come back and we continue to nip at this curve and we have lower incidents and that we can really have the spring semester that we all want for our kids, which is an in-person experience, as quickly as we possibly can. So thanks again for being here tonight. Take care. Happy holidays. We'll see you back soon.